The evening rush at Joe's diner had just begun to slow when the glass door burst open, bringing with it a gust of icy wind and rain. Sarah Martinez nearly dropped her coffee pot at the sight before her, a large, soaking wet German shepherd standing in the entrance, carefully holding a bundle of blankets in his mouth. The diner fell silent as patrons turned to stare, their forks frozen midway to their mouths. Through the slight gap in the wet blankets, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her heart stop. Tiny fingers moving against the fabric. Her years of paramedic training kicked in before her brain could process the impossibility of the scene. Time seemed to slow as Sarah placed the coffee pot on the nearest table and approached the dog. The animal's intelligent eyes locked with hers, pleading and determined. His fur was matted with mud and rain, but his gentle hold on the precious cargo never wavered. Sarah could hear her co-worker Lisa calling 911 in the background, but her focus remained entirely on the bundle being presented to her. As she carefully took the blankets from the dog's mouth, a soft whimper emerged from within. The baby couldn't have been more than 6 months old, its small body cold but alive. The German shepherd remained at attention, watching every move Sarah made with unwavering focus. The diner's warmth began to thaw Sarah's shock as her medical training took over. She quickly assessed the infant, female, responsive, cold, but not critically so, no visible injuries. The baby's onesie was embroidered with the name Grace, and a medical alert bracelet on her tiny wrist indicated a penicillin allergy. The dog hadn't moved from his protective stance, his eyes never leaving the child. Despite his exhausted state, he maintained a dignified bearing that spoke of professional training. Sarah noticed a worn tag on his collar that read Max above a partially smudged phone number. The combination of the dog's behavior and the medical alert bracelet told her this was no random occurrence. This was a rescue. As sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah began the process of warming the baby, using clean linens from the diner's supply. Her mind raced with questions about the circumstances that would lead a trained service dog to make such a desperate journey. The other customers had gathered around, offering blankets and assistance. While Max finally allowed himself to collapse onto the diner's floor, his mission accomplished, Sarah found herself fighting back tears as she watched the dog's unwavering dedication. Even in exhaustion, it reminded her painfully of her own service dog, Bear, who she had lost 2 years ago in the accident that ended her paramedic career. Something about Max's determined eyes spoke to the part of her soul that had been dormant since that day. The paramedics arrived with a rush of activity and urgency, but Sarah found herself reluctant to hand over the baby. A heavy sense of responsibility had settled over her from the moment Max had appeared in the doorway. As she finally transferred Grace to the care of the EMTs, she felt Max's wet nose press against her hand. Looking down, she saw in his eyes the same need she felt, to see this through, to make sure Grace and whatever family she belonged to was safe. Without fully understanding why, Sarah knew that her life had irrevocably changed the moment that door had swung open. The real question was, what would she discover when she followed this path to its end? Sarah sat in the waiting room of Chicago General Hospital, her waitress uniform still damp from Max's wet fur. The German shepherd lay at her feet, refusing to leave despite the hospital staff's initial protests. After she had explained the situation and shown them Max's service dog credentials, they had made an exception. She hadn't been able to bring herself to wash the mud from his fur yet. It felt like evidence of his incredible journey, one that the police were now trying to trace backward through the stormy night. The rhythmic sound of Max's breathing helped calm her racing thoughts as they waited for news about the baby. Officer Jenkins had just finished taking her statement, his weathered face showing clear amazement at Max's feat. The partial phone number from his collar had led them to a vehicle registration for Emma Collins. Age 24, and reports of a car accident on Route 27, they'd found Emma unconscious but alive in her overturned car, now being treated in the ICU. Sarah's fingers absently found their way to Max's ears, scratching gently as she had done countless times with Bear. The simple gesture brought back a flood of memories, the weight of her medical kit, the sound of sirens, and Bear's steady presence through countless emergency calls. She had thought that chapter of her life was firmly closed, but tonight had awakened something she thought long buried. The emergency room doctor, Dr. Patterson, approached with a clipboard and a tired smile. Baby Grace was stable, suffering from mild hypothermia and a high fever, but responding well to treatment. Sarah felt Max tense beside her, as if he understood every word. When she asked about Emma's condition, the doctor's expression grew more serious. Emma had a concussion and several broken ribs, but would recover. What concerned them more was her medical history, regular appointments for depression and anxiety. With Max listed as her registered emotional support animal, Sarah looked down at the dog who had saved not one, but two members of his family tonight. His deep brown eyes met hers with an intelligence that made her chest ache with recognition. A nurse approached, asking if Sarah could help with Grace. The baby was distressed, crying inconsolably despite their best efforts. Without hesitation, Sarah followed, Max padding silently beside her. The moment they entered the pediatric unit, Grace's cries became whimpers, her tiny face turning toward the familiar sound of Max's paws on the floor. Sarah watched in amazement as the dog gently rested his head near the baby's feet, maintaining his vigil from a new position. The nurse explained that they needed someone to stay with Grace overnight, as child services wouldn't be available until morning. The words were barely out of her mouth before Sarah was nodding. Already knowing she wouldn't be leaving, she had spent too many nights in hospitals turning patients over to strangers. As the night shift settled in around them, Sarah found herself telling Max about Bear, about the accident that had taken him from her, and about her decision to leave emergency medicine behind. The dog listened with the same intense focus he'd shown at the diner, as if he understood the weight of every word. When she finally ran out of words, Max shifted slightly, resting his head in her lap. A gesture so familiar it made her eyes sting. Together, they watched over Grace as the storm outside began to fade. Two guardians united by circumstance, and something deeper, something that felt surprisingly like purpose. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this night wasn't just about saving Grace and Emma. Perhaps in some way, it was about saving herself too. The soft morning light filtered through the hospital blinds as Emma Collins slowly regained consciousness. Her first coherent thought was of panic. Where was Grace? Where was Max? She tried to sit up but was stopped by both the pain in her ribs and Sarah's gentle hand on her shoulder. The stranger wore a waitress uniform and had kind eyes that somehow managed to convey both authority and compassion. Before Emma could speak, a familiar furry head appeared at her bedside and Max's warm eyes met hers. The relief that flooded through her was overwhelming, bringing tears to her eyes as her faithful companion nuzzled her hand. Sarah watched the reunion with understanding, explaining how Max had brought Grace to safety at the diner. Emma listened in amazement as Sarah recounted the events of the previous night. Each detail of Max's journey made her heart swell with love and gratitude for the dog who had been her anchor through the darkest times of her life. When she'd first gotten Max from the service dog training center, she never imagined he would end up saving both her and her daughter's lives. As if sensing her thoughts, Max pressed closer, his solid presence as reassuring as ever. Sarah described how he had refused to leave Grace's side all night, maintaining his protective watch even as the baby slept peacefully in the pediatric unit. Emma's tears flowed freely now, her hand buried in Max's fur. Drawing strength from his steadfast presence, the conversation between the two women flowed naturally, as if they'd known each other for years rather than hours. Emma shared how she'd struggled with depression after Grace's father had abandoned them during her pregnancy, and how Max had been her lifeline, helping her find the strength to build a life for herself and her daughter. Sarah found herself opening up about Bear and the accident that had derailed her life, surprised by how easy it was to share her pain with this young mother who understood the profound bond between humans and their canine companions. Max moved between them, offering comfort to both women, his intuition uncanny in its precision. They were interrupted by a nurse bringing Grace, who was now fever-free and eager to be reunited with her mother. The scene that followed brought tears to the eyes of even the most seasoned hospital staff. Max positioned himself protectively near the bed as Emma held her daughter. For the first time since the accident, his tail wagging gently as he watched his family reunite. Sarah observed the tableau with a bittersweet smile, remembering countless similar moments from her paramedic days when tragedy had been averted and families brought back together. She found herself reluctant to leave, even though her role in this drama seemed to be coming to an end. As if reading her thoughts, Emma reached out and grasped her hand, asking her to stay a little longer. The connection that had formed between them in the wake of Max's heroic actions felt too important to simply walk away from. Dr. Patterson arrived to discuss Emma's recovery plan, explaining that she would need help, during the initial weeks after her release. Without hesitation, Sarah found herself offering assistance, surprising herself as much as Emma. The prospect of returning to her solitary life at the diner suddenly seemed impossible after the events of the past 12 hours. Max's gaze moved between the two women as they exchanged phone numbers and made plans, his expression almost smug, as if he had known all along that his midnight journey would lead to more than just a physical rescue. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crumble, brought down by the combined forces of a brave dog, a resilient young mother, and a baby whose life had brought them all together. The next few days fell into a rhythm that surprised Sarah with its naturalness. Between her shifts at the diner, she found herself drawn back to the hospital, helping Emma navigate her recovery and spending time with Grace. Max's presence remained constant, his dedicated vigilance extending now to include Sarah in his protective circle. The staff had grown used to seeing the trio, plus one furry guardian, together, sharing quiet conversations and gentle laughter in Emma's room. For Sarah, each visit chipped away at the protective shell she'd built around herself since losing Bear. Though she still caught herself holding back at times, afraid to become too invested, too vulnerable, Emma's progress was steady, but the challenges ahead were daunting. As a single mother with limited support, the logistics of managing her recovery while caring for Grace seemed overwhelming. During one particularly difficult evening, when the pain medication wasn't quite cutting it and Grace was fussy, Emma finally broke down. Sarah found her crying silently, trying not to wake her finally. Sleeping daughter, Max had immediately alerted Sarah to Emma's distress, proving once again his exceptional emotional intelligence without thinking. Sarah did what felt natural. She pulled up a chair, took Emma's hand and listened. The young mother's fears poured out. Fear of not being strong enough, of failing Grace, of being unable to manage on her own. Through it all, Max moved between them, offering his solid presence as anchor and comfort. The solution came to Sarah during her next shift at Joe's diner, as she mechanically refilled coffee cups, while her mind wandered to Emma and Grace. Her small 2-bedroom apartment had felt too big, too empty since Bear's death. The second bedroom, once her home office from her paramedic days, had remained largely untouched, a shrine to a life she'd left behind. When she presented the idea to Emma, moving in temporarily during her recovery, she was met with initial resistance. Emma was fiercely independent, proud of the life she'd built for herself and Grace. But as they discussed the practicalities with Max watching the conversation like a tennis match, both women recognized the logic of the arrangement. It wasn't just about helping Emma. Sarah was beginning to realize how much she needed this too. The decision seemed to energize everyone. The hospital social worker praised their proactive planning, and Dr. Patterson noted Emma's improved spirits. Even Joe, Sarah's usually gruff boss, softened when she requested a more flexible schedule. Having witnessed Max's dramatic entrance that first night as they began planning the logistics of the temporary living arrangement, Sarah found herself cleaning out the spare room with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She came across Bear's old bed still stored in the closet, and after a moment's hesitation, placed it in the corner of the living room. When she mentioned this to Emma during her next visit, trying to sound casual, Emma's eyes filled with understanding tears. Max would need somewhere comfortable to sleep. After all, though they both knew it was about much more than just practical considerations, that evening, as Sarah drove home from the hospital, she found herself taking the long route past the accident site where she'd lost Bear. She hadn't been back since that day, but something about recent events made her feel ready to face those memories. As she pulled over at the familiar bend in the road, she was struck not by the usual wave of paralyzing grief, but by a new sensation: gratitude. Gratitude for Bear's years of companionship, for the lives they'd saved together, and for the twist of fate that had brought a mud-covered German shepherd and his precious cargo through her diner's door. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, something that felt remarkably like hope. Tomorrow, Emma and Grace would be discharged, and a new chapter would begin. Sarah was surprised to realize she was ready for it, ready to open her home and her heart again, one paw print at a time. The morning of Emma's discharge brought a flurry of activity to Sarah's apartment. She found herself making last-minute adjustments, ensuring everything was accessible for someone with healing ribs. The spare room had been transformed into a cozy nursery bedroom combination, with Grace's portable crib nestled safely in one corner. Sarah had spent the previous evening installing baby gates and cabinet locks, skills she hadn't used since her days of home safety assessments as a paramedic. As she worked, she kept catching glimpses of Bear's old bed in the living room, no longer a source of pain, but a symbol of new beginnings. The apartment that had felt too quiet for so long was about to be filled with life again. The drive to the hospital carried a different energy than previous visits. Emma sat in the passenger seat, Grace securely fastened in her car seat behind them, while Max maintained his watchful position in the back. The German shepherd's head swiveled between his charges, his presence both protective and reassuring. Sarah couldn't help but notice how natural it felt, this impromptu family unit they had created. The radio played softly in the background as Emma shared stories about Grace's first months, her voice growing stronger with each passing mile. The conversation flowed easily between them, punctuated by Grace's occasional happy gurgles and Max's contented sighs. It struck Sarah that this was the first time in years she'd felt truly present in her own life, not just going through the motions. Arriving at the apartment brought its own challenges and victories. Emma's determination to maintain some independence despite her injuries reminded Sarah of herself after the accident. They worked out a system, Sarah handling the heavier lifting while Emma directed the organization, with Max surprisingly helpful in carrying lighter items in his specially designed service dog backpack. Grace watched the proceedings from her bouncer, occasionally reaching out to pat Max's fur as he passed by. The dog's gentleness with the baby continued to amaze Sarah. Though Emma explained it had been this way since she brought Grace home from the hospital, Max had appointed himself chief baby monitor long before his heroic rescue, alerting Emma to Grace's every need with an intelligence that seemed almost human. As evening approached, they settled into what would become their new routine. Sarah prepared a simple dinner, while Emma fed Grace, Max alternating his attention between the kitchen and the living room, as if unable to decide where he was needed most. The domestic scene stirred something in Sarah's chest, a warmth she had almost forgotten she could feel. Over dinner, Emma opened up about her own struggles with depression and how Max had quite literally saved her life more than once, long before his dramatic rescue of Grace. Her honesty encouraged Sarah to share more about the accident that took Bear. Finding that the words came easier now, the memories less sharp-edged as they talked, Max moved between them, offering his steady presence to whichever woman needed it most in the moment, his intuition as keen as ever. The day ended with an unexpected moment of peace after Grace was asleep in her crib. The three adults, counting Max, who Sarah was beginning to think of as the wisest among them, sat in the living room, sharing a comfortable silence. The dog had chosen to lie in Bear's old bed, a sight that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. But for the first time, they were not entirely sad tears. Emma reached over and squeezed her hand. No words needed between them. Both women understood they were at the beginning of something important, a journey of healing that none of them could have predicted a week ago. As Sarah watched Max drift off to sleep, his protective instincts momentarily at rest, she realized that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism aren't the dramatic rescues, but the quiet courage it takes to open your heart again after loss. The first week of their new living arrangement brought both challenges and unexpected moments of joy. Sarah found herself rediscovering her medical training in gentler ways, helping Emma with her physical therapy exercises, while Max watched attentively. As if taking mental notes, the dog had developed an uncanny ability to anticipate when Emma would need support standing up, positioning himself perfectly to act as a steady brace during these moments. Sarah was reminded of her years working with therapy dogs in rehabilitation clinics. Though she'd never seen one quite as intuitive as Max, his dedication to both Emma and Grace was a constant reminder of the depth of connection possible between humans and their animal companions. Grace seemed to thrive in the new environment, her baby giggles filling the apartment at all hours. She had taken to reaching for Sarah whenever she entered the room, a development that both warmed and terrified Sarah's heart. One afternoon, while Emma rested, Sarah found herself singing old lullabies to Grace during her fussy period, songs her own mother had sung to her. Max lay nearby, his tail gently thumping against the floor in rhythm with her voice. The simple domesticity of the moment caught her off guard, making her realize how much she had missed having a sense of purpose beyond her shifts at the diner. Emma, watching quietly from the doorway, saw the transformation happening in her new friend, understanding that healing was a two-way street. The nighttime routine had become a carefully choreographed dance between the three adults. Max would alert them to Grace's slightest stirring, often before the baby monitor picked up any sound. Sarah marveled at his ability to distinguish between Grace's different cries, somehow knowing whether she was hungry, needed changing, or just wanted comfort, during one particularly difficult night. When Grace was teething and inconsolable, they all ended up in the living room at 3 in the morning. Emma, exhausted from her healing ribs, leaned against Sarah while they took turns walking. Max moved between them, offering his calm presence and occasional gentle licks to Grace's feet, making her giggle despite her discomfort. It was in these unguarded moments that their impromptu family felt most real. Their days fell into a pattern that felt surprisingly natural. Sarah adjusted her schedule at the diner, working morning shifts that allowed her to be home when Emma had physical therapy appointments. Joe, her boss, had become unexpectedly supportive, even sending home extra portions of soup when he heard Emma was having a rough day. The regular customers often asked about the hero dog, and Sarah found herself sharing updates about Max's continued dedication to his family. She noticed that talking about Max and her new living situation no longer brought up painful memories of Bear, but instead filled her with a sense of purpose. She had thought lost forever. The past and present were beginning to weave together in a way that felt healing rather than haunting. Emma's strength grew daily, both physically and emotionally. During their evening conversations, she shared more about her struggles with depression and how Max had been her lifeline during pregnancy. The dog had been trained specifically to recognize signs of emotional distress, a skill he now extended to both women. One evening, when Sarah was lost in memories of her last day with Bear, Max gently placed his head in her lap, grounding her in the present moment. Emma watched the interaction with understanding eyes, recognizing the same comfort Max had provided her countless times as they sat together in the growing dusk, Grace sleeping peacefully in her crib. Both women acknowledged silently how their lives had been transformed by one dog's extraordinary capacity for love and loyalty. 2 weeks into their cohabitation, Sarah woke to find Max sitting beside her bed, his expression alerting her that something needed attention. Following him to Emma's room, she found her friend in the midst of an anxiety attack, something that had been happening less frequently but hadn't disappeared entirely. Without hesitation, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, using the grounding techniques Emma had previously shared with her. Max positioned himself between them, creating a triangle of support that somehow made everything feel manageable. As Emma's breathing steadied, she confessed her fear of becoming too dependent on Sarah's help, of being a burden. The word struck a chord in Sarah, who realized she had been harboring similar fears about becoming too attached to this makeshift family. The morning brought a breakthrough during Emma's physical therapy session at home. The therapist remarked on her exceptional progress, attributing it partly to the supportive environment. As they worked through exercises, Max maintained his usual attentive presence, occasionally serving as a balance support. Sarah, watching from the kitchen while preparing lunch, found herself using skills from her paramedic days to suggest modifications that might help with Emma's rib pain. It was the first time she had voluntarily referenced her medical background without feeling the sharp sting of loss. Later, Emma pointed out that Sarah seemed more at peace when using her healthcare knowledge, an observation that led to a long conversation about how helping others had always been Sarah's true calling. Even if the form that help took needed to change, Grace reached a milestone that afternoon. Rolling over for the first time in their presence, the apartment erupted in celebration. With Max circling excitedly, his tail wagging with obvious pride, Sarah found herself documenting the moment on her phone. Suddenly aware that she had dozens of similar photos and videos from the past weeks, Emma tearfully shared that she had worried Grace would miss out on having a large, supportive family, being raised by a single mother. Looking around at their odd but loving household, she realized her daughter had exactly what she'd hoped for. Just in an unexpected form, the moment was interrupted by Max bringing over Grace's favorite toy, his timing impeccable as always, making both women laugh through their tears. These small moments of joy were becoming more frequent, healing old wounds neither had realized were still so raw during dinner preparation that evening. They received an unexpected visit from Joe, Sarah's boss, who had been quietly supporting their situation from the beginning. He brought not only food, but also a proposition. Noting Sarah's renewed interest in healthcare, he suggested she consider training as a veterinary technician, offering to adjust her work schedule to accommodate classes. The idea resonated with something that had been growing in Sarah's mind, a way to combine her medical background with her deepened understanding of the human-animal bond as they discussed the possibility. Max sat attentively nearby, his expression almost knowing. Emma pointed out how Sarah's face lit up at the suggestion, reminding her of the passionate paramedic she'd described from her past. The conversation continued into the evening, focusing not on what had been lost, but on what could be built anew. It was Max who eventually broke up the planning session, indicating it was time for Grace's bedtime routine, his internal clock as reliable as ever. The apartment was unusually quiet one morning when Sarah returned from her shift at the diner. She found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, holding a letter with trembling hands, while Max pressed reassuringly against her legs. The letter was from Grace's father, Mark, who had somehow learned about the accident and was suddenly expressing interest in being part of his daughter's life. Sarah felt a protective surge as she watched Emma struggle with this unexpected development. The timing seemed cruel. Just as Emma was finding her footing again, Max, sensing the tension, moved between the two women, offering his steady presence while Emma shared her complicated feelings about Mark's sudden reappearance. The bond between them had grown strong enough that words weren't always necessary. Sarah simply sat and listened, understanding that sometimes silence is the best support. Later that afternoon, during Grace's nap time, Emma opened up about her history with Mark. Their relationship had ended during her pregnancy, when the reality of impending parenthood proved too much for him. His departure had triggered her depression, leading to the decision to get Max as an emotional support animal. The dog, who had been dozing nearby, perked up at the mention of this history. As if remembering those early days, Sarah found herself sharing her own experiences with abandonment, speaking for the first time about how losing Bear had felt like losing her last connection to her old life. As they talked, both women realized how their past wounds had shaped their present strengths. Max moved between them, alternately offering comfort and checking on Grace, his actions a reminder of the unconditional love that had helped heal them both. The day took another turn when Sarah received a call from the veterinary college she'd inquired about. They had an opening in their upcoming technician program and were particularly interested in her medical background. The excitement of the news momentarily overshadowed the morning's tension, leading to an impromptu celebration. During Grace's afternoon feeding, Emma insisted on making plans right there. Offering to adjust their household routine to accommodate Sarah's future classes, the natural way they had learned to support each other's dreams felt like a direct rebuke to the memories of abandonment they'd discussed earlier. Max watched the planning session with apparent approval, his tail wagging whenever Sarah mentioned working with animals. The path ahead seemed clearer now, though not without its challenges. Evening found them all in the living room, the weight of the day's emotions settling around them like a heavy blanket. Grace was particularly fussy, perhaps sensing the underlying tension. It was Max who broke the mood, bringing toy after toy to the baby until she finally giggled, her laughter cutting through the serious atmosphere. The sight of the large dog gently entertaining the infant reminded them both of the night he had carried her to safety, and how far they had all come since then. As they discussed Mark's letter again, this time with clearer heads, they realized that their unconventional family unit had grown stronger than any traditional bonds that might try to shake it. Sarah watched Emma with grace, saw how Max maintained his protective vigil, and understood that sometimes the families we choose are more real than the ones we're born into. Sarah's first day of veterinary technician classes coincided with Emma's decision to respond to Mark's letter. The morning was a whirlwind of activity as they navigated their new schedule. With Sarah rushing to make it to orientation, while Emma prepared for a meeting with her lawyer, Max seemed to sense the significance of the day, alternating between helping Emma with Grace's morning routine and checking on Sarah's preparations. His ability to divide his attention between all three of his humans had become even more refined over the weeks. Though today he seemed particularly attuned to Emma's nervous energy. Before leaving, Sarah found herself giving Emma a fierce hug, the kind that conveyed everything words couldn't express. They had come so far from that stormy night in the diner. The veterinary college campus felt both familiar and foreign to Sarah. The medical terminology came back easily, echoing her paramedic training, but now filtered through a new lens of understanding. During the introduction session, she shared Max's story, watching her classmates' faces light up with professional interest and human compassion. The instructor, Dr. Chen, took particular interest in Sarah's experience with service animals, suggesting she might want to specialize in working with therapy and support dogs. The possibility resonated deeply, connecting her past life with this new direction. During the lunch break, she found herself texting Emma updates. Realizing that sharing her excitement with someone who understood made it even more meaningful. Max's influence on her life choices was undeniable, and she felt Bear would have approved of this new path. Meanwhile, Emma faced her own challenges at the lawyer's office. She had sent Sarah a text describing how Max had positioned himself protectively between her and the desk as they discussed Mark's legal rights. The lawyer explained the complexities of their situation, but emphasized that Emma's documented history of responsible parenting, including her choice to get Max as a support animal, worked in her favor. The discussion of custody arrangements and visitation rights felt overwhelming, but Emma found strength in knowing she had a support system waiting at home. Her lawyer seemed particularly impressed by Max's calm, professional demeanor in the office, noting how such stability was beneficial for Grace's well-being. The dog's presence made the difficult conversation more manageable, his steady gaze a reminder that she wasn't facing this alone that evening. Their apartment became a sanctuary of shared experiences and mutual support. Sarah's enthusiasm about her classes mixed with Emma's cautious optimism about setting boundaries with Mark. Grace, picking up on the positive energy, was especially giggly during her bedtime routine as they settled in the living room. Max made his usual rounds, checking on each member of his family before settling into Bear's old bed, which had become his favorite spot. The sight still touched Sarah's heart, but now it felt right, like a passing of the torch. They discussed their day's events, planning for the challenges ahead while celebrating their individual steps forward. Emma expressed her gratitude for having Sarah in their lives, acknowledging how their chance encounter through Max's heroism had grown into something neither of them had expected, but both desperately needed. The evening ended with a sense of purpose and possibility, their unlikely family unit stronger for facing their fears together. The veterinary college quickly became Sarah's second home, her natural empathy with animals enhanced by her medical background. During a practical session on behavioral assessment, she found herself sharing the story of Max's rescue with Dr. Chen, who was fascinated by the dog's extraordinary display of intelligence and loyalty. The conversation led to an unexpected opportunity when Dr. Chen suggested that Max and Emma might be willing to participate in a study on the bond between service dogs and their handlers. The research would focus on how these relationships benefit both parties, particularly in cases involving emotional support and childcare. Sarah felt a familiar spark of excitement, the same one she used to get when starting a challenging paramedic shift. This time, though, it wasn't about emergency response, but about understanding and documenting the profound connections she witnessed daily. Emma's first supervised visit with Mark was scheduled for that afternoon. Bringing a new wave of anxiety to their household, Max had been unusually attentive all morning, staying close to Emma as she prepared Grace for the meeting. The community center's family room felt sterile and impersonal, but Max's presence helped create a sense of normalcy for Grace. Sarah had offered to wait outside, giving the family privacy while remaining close enough if needed. As she watched through the window, she saw how Max positioned himself strategically between Mark and Emma, maintaining a friendly demeanor while clearly communicating his protective role. The dog's ability to navigate complex social situations with such grace reminded Sarah of Bear's similar intuition during tense emergency scenes. Mark seemed taken aback by the level of trust and communication between Emma, Grace, and Max. Perhaps realizing for the first time what he had walked away from, that evening, their apartment became a haven of emotional processing. Emma shared her mixed feelings about the visit, acknowledging that while Mark seemed genuinely interested in Grace, his presence had stirred up old insecurities. Sarah listened while preparing dinner, her hands busy with familiar tasks as Emma talked through her concerns. Max divided his attention between Grace's play area and Emma's spot at the kitchen counter, his movements a choreographed dance of support and protection. The conversation shifted to Dr. Chen's research proposal, and Emma brightened at the idea of Max's special abilities being studied and documented. She spoke about how his support had given her the confidence to face Mark as an equal rather than a victim, and how his presence continued to ground her during challenging moments. As night fell and Grace drifted off to sleep, the three adults settled into their evening routine. Sarah shared more details about her veterinary training, her eyes lighting up as she described learning to read animal body language more precisely. She could now better appreciate the subtle ways Max communicated with each of them, his behaviors fine-tuned to their individual needs. Emma listened intently, occasionally adding her own observations from years of working with Max. The dog lay between them, apparently following their conversation with his usual intelligent focus, when Sarah demonstrated some of the calming techniques she'd learned in class. Max willingly participated, seeming to understand he was helping teach important lessons. The evening ended with a sense of forward momentum, each of them growing in their own way while supporting the other's progress. Their unconventional family had become a space where healing and growth flourished. Bound together by paw prints and trust, Dr. Chen's research project began on a crisp autumn morning, transforming their living room into a casual observation space. The professor was immediately struck by Max's extraordinary awareness of everyone's emotional states, particularly his ability to anticipate Grace's needs before she became distressed. Sarah watched with professional interest as Dr. Chen documented Max's behaviors, recognizing patterns she had observed but never formally studied. The dog seemed to understand the importance of the session, demonstrating his full range of support skills from emotional grounding techniques with Emma to his gentle supervision of Grace's playtime. Emma shared stories of Max's training and his growth alongside her during pregnancy, her voice strong with pride and gratitude. The academic validation of what they had all experienced personally felt like a milestone, marking how far they had come from that stormy night. Later that day, Emma received news that would test their family unit's strength. Her apartment building's management had decided not to renew her lease, citing renovations. The irony of potentially losing her home just as her life was stabilizing hit hard. Sarah found her in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter while Max pressed against her legs in his classic calming position. Without hesitation, Sarah voiced what they had both been considering but hadn't dared discuss, making their temporary living arrangement permanent. The conversation that followed was filled with practical concerns and emotional revelations, but underneath ran a current of rightness that neither could deny. Max moved between them as they talked, his presence a reminder of how he had brought them together in the first place. The decision to officially combine their households led to a weekend of planning and reorganization. Sarah's veterinary textbooks found homes alongside Emma's novels, while Grace's toys spread throughout the apartment in a cheerful invasion. As they worked, they discovered items that sparked stories. Emma's first photo with Max as a puppy, Sarah's paramedic graduation picture with Bear, Grace's earliest onesies. Max supervised the proceedings with apparent satisfaction, occasionally bringing his own toys to add to the general mixing of lives. The physical blending of their belongings seemed to cement something that had been building for months, a sense of permanence, of family chosen rather than given. Even Grace seemed to sense the significance, babbling happily as she watched them create their shared space. The evening brought a surprise visit from Joe. Bearing dinner and news, the diner's small adjacent storefront was becoming available, and he had an idea, a pet-friendly cafe space where service dogs in training could practice their skills in a controlled environment. He had already spoken with local service dog organizations who were enthusiastic about the concept. As Sarah and Emma listened to his proposal, they exchanged glances full of possibility. The idea combined Sarah's medical and veterinary knowledge with Emma's first-hand experience with service animals, while providing a way to help others going through similar struggles. Max's rescue had not only saved Grace that night, it had set in motion a chain of events that was now offering them all a chance at a new purpose. As they discussed the potential of this new venture, Max settled contentedly into Bear's bed, his expression serene as he watched his family dream bigger than they had dared before. The transformation of the storefront beside Joe's diner became a family project that energized them all. Sarah spent her evenings after veterinary classes sketching layout plans while Emma researched requirements for service dog training facilities. Max accompanied them on their daily visits to the space, seeming to understand its significance as he explored each corner with professional interest. His presence during the planning stages proved invaluable. They found themselves designing the layout around his movements, creating optimal paths for service dogs to navigate while working. Grace watched the proceedings from her portable playpen, her delighted giggles echoing through the empty space whenever Max demonstrated proper service dog behaviors for their planning sessions. Dr. Chen's enthusiasm for the cafe project added an unexpected dimension to her research. She suggested incorporating a formal observation area where students could study service dog interactions in a real-world setting. The idea expanded their vision from a simple cafe to an educational space that could benefit both the community and future veterinary professionals. Emma found herself sharing her experiences during these planning sessions, her voice growing stronger as she described how Max had helped her through depression and into motherhood. Sarah watched her friend's transformation with pride, remembering the vulnerable young mother from the hospital and seeing now a confident woman helping shape a space where others could find the same support she had received. The unique challenges of coordinating construction while maintaining their daily routines brought the household closer together. Mark's scheduled visits with Grace continued, and to everyone's surprise, he offered to help with the renovation work on his free weekends. Max's response to Mark's increasing presence remained professionally courteous while maintaining his protective watch over Emma and Grace. During one particularly dusty afternoon of demolition work, Sarah found herself working alongside Mark, sharing stories about Bear and discussing the impact service dogs had on their lives. The conversation gave her new insight into the man who had once run from responsibility but was now trying to find his way back. Max observed their interaction from his post near Grace's playpen, his expression seemingly approving of this careful rebuilding of trust. As the cafe space began taking shape, so did their expanded family dynamic. Evening planning sessions often turned into impromptu family dinners, with Joe bringing leftovers from the diner and Dr. Chen contributing insights from her research. Grace thrived in the lively atmosphere, developing a particular fascination with Dr. Chen's notebook and pen. Max maintained his role as family guardian, but with a new dimension of pride as he demonstrated proper service dog protocols for Dr. Chen's documentation. The concept of family had stretched and grown to include this diverse group of people brought together by one dog's extraordinary act of heroism. Sarah often found herself watching these gatherings, feeling Bear's presence in the love and purpose that now filled their lives. The pain of loss had transformed into appreciation for the unexpected gifts that had followed. Much like the storefront's transformation from empty space to promising future, the grand opening of Paw Prints Cafe approached with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Sarah had completed her first semester of veterinary technician training, her knowledge already proving invaluable in setting up the cafe's service dog training areas. The space had evolved into something beyond their initial vision. One side housed a cozy cafe where service dogs and their handlers could practice real-world skills, while the other featured a professional training area, complete with Dr. Chen's observation room. Max had become something of a mascot during the final stages of preparation. Demonstrating perfect service dog etiquette for the local trainers who had partnered with them, his calm confidence seemed to radiate throughout the space, setting the tone for what they hoped to achieve. Emma's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the journey. The young mother who had once struggled with depression now conducted orientation sessions for new service dog handlers. Sharing her story with quiet strength, her experiences with Max had become a source of hope for others facing similar challenges. During one particularly moving session, she described the night of the accident, how Max had saved not only Grace, but had inadvertently created a family in the process. Sarah, listening from the cafe counter while training a new barista, felt tears prick her eyes as she remembered that stormy night. Grace, now crawling and babbling, spent her days charming customers and staff alike, safely supervised by Max's watchful eye. The dog had somehow managed to expand his protective circle to include their growing community while never neglecting his primary family duties. The week before opening brought an unexpected moment of healing. Mark, who had continued to help with the renovation work, arrived with a gift, a professional portrait of Bear he had commissioned based on Sarah's old photos to hang in the cafe's entrance hall. The gesture left Sarah speechless. Understanding the hours of conversation about her former partner had resonated deeply with him. Emma found her later that evening, still standing before the portrait with Max leaning against her legs. They talked about how loss can lead to unexpected beginnings, and how healing often comes in forms we never anticipate. Max listened to their conversation with his characteristic intelligence, occasionally nudging their hands when emotions ran high, demonstrating the very skills they hoped to help other dogs develop in this space. As they put the finishing touches on the cafe, Their extended family gathered for a private celebration. Joe brought his famous comfort food. Dr. Chen arrived with her research team, and even some of Sarah's veterinary classmates joined the group. Grace delighted everyone by taking her first wobbling steps across the cafe floor, straight toward Max, who watched with obvious pride. The sight of their baby girl toddling beneath the portrait of Bear seemed to perfectly capture their journey, a mix of past and present, loss and love, all woven together into something beautiful and unexpected. The evening ended with quiet conversation and shared dreams for the space they had created. As Sarah watched Emma demonstrate Max's training techniques to an enthusiastic audience, she realized they had built more than just a cafe. They had created a place where broken hearts could heal and new bonds could form. All thanks to one dog's extraordinary capacity for love. The first month of Paw Prints Cafe exceeded all expectations. Word spread quickly through the service dog community about this unique space where handlers and dogs could train in a supportive environment. Sarah found herself drawing on both her veterinary training and paramedic experience as she helped coordinate between trainers, handlers and the cafe staff. Each day brought new stories of connection and healing, reminding her of why they had embarked on this venture. Max remained a constant presence, his calm demeanor setting the standard for the service dogs in training. His gentle guidance of Grace, who had become the cafe's unofficial greeter, served as a living demonstration of the profound bond between humans and their canine companions. Emma's support group for handlers with emotional support animals had grown from a small weekly meeting to a vital community resource. During one particularly moving session, a young woman shared how seeing Emma and Max's relationship had given her hope during her own struggle with anxiety. Grace sat contentedly in Emma's lap throughout the meeting, occasionally reaching out to pat Max, who maintained his protective position beside them. The sight of mother and daughter, both so much stronger than they had been that stormy night, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She remembered Emma's early days of uncertainty, contrasting them with the confident woman who now helped others find their way through similar challenges. The transformation wasn't just in Emma. They had all grown, healing each other in ways they hadn't expected. Dr. Chen's research had evolved into a comprehensive study of service dog integration in public spaces. With Paw Prints Cafe as her primary case study, the observation room had become a valuable training tool, allowing handlers to review and improve their interactions with their dogs. Even Mark had found his place in their expanding community, volunteering his construction skills to build custom training equipment and spending quality time with Grace during his visits. The cafe had become more than just a business. It was a testament to the healing power of purpose and connection. Max seemed to take particular pride in his role as senior service dog, demonstrating perfect behavior for newcomers while maintaining his watchful care over his family. One quiet evening, after closing time, Sarah found herself sitting with Emma at their favorite corner table. Grace had fallen asleep in her playpen nearby, with Max keeping his usual vigil. They watched as the setting sun cast long shadows through the cafe windows, highlighting Bear's portrait on the wall. The conversation turned to how far they had come since that first night at Joe's diner. Emma spoke about her growing confidence as a mother and group leader, while Sarah shared her excitement about nearing the completion of her veterinary technician certification. Max lay between them, occasionally lifting his head to check on Grace, his presence a reminder of how one dog's extraordinary act of courage had set all of this in motion. The space they had created together was helping others find the same healing and purpose they had found, creating ripples of positive change that extended far beyond their own story. 1 year to the day since Max burst through the diner door with Grace, the extended family gathered at Paw Prints Cafe for a special celebration. The space had become everything they'd hoped for and more, a sanctuary where the healing power of the human-animal bond was celebrated daily. Sarah, now a certified veterinary technician, stood behind the counter, watching the scene unfold. Grace, steady on her feet now, toddled between guests with Max never far behind, his greying muzzle the only sign of time's passage. The sight of them together still brought back vivid memories of that stormy night, though now the memories carried more wonder than worry. The portrait of Bear overlooked the gathering, a reminder of how love never truly leaves us. It just transforms into something new. Emma had blossomed into a respected figure in the service dog community, her story inspiring others to trust in the healing power of these extraordinary animals. During the celebration, she shared a surprise announcement with their gathered friends and family. She had been asked to help develop a training program for emotional support animals at the state level. With Max serving as the model for behavioral standards, the pride in her voice as she spoke reflected how far she had come from the struggling young mother who had once felt so alone. Sarah watched as Mark, now a regular presence in Grace's life, congratulated Emma with genuine warmth. Max sat between them, his posture relaxed but alert, a living symbol of how trust and loyalty could bridge even the deepest divides. Dr. Chen's research had garnered national attention, with Paw Prints Cafe being recognized as a model for service dog integration in public spaces. As she presented her findings to the gathered crowd, Sarah reflected on how their small community had grown. Joe beamed from his seat, his initial leap of faith in offering the storefront having paid off beyond anyone's expectations. The cafe had become a place where broken spirits found healing, where boundaries between humans and animals blurred into something sacred. Through it all, Max had remained their steady center, demonstrating daily the extraordinary capacity of dogs to transform lives. His dedication to Grace had never wavered, though he had somehow found room in his heart to help countless other handlers and dogs find their way as the evening drew to a close. Sarah found herself alone with Emma and Max in their favorite corner of the cafe. Grace had fallen asleep in Mark's arms, the picture of peace and security. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight play across Bear's portrait. Max rested his head on Sarah's lap, his eyes holding the same steady wisdom that had guided them all to this moment. Emma reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. No words needed between them. They had learned that family comes in many forms, that healing happens in its own time, and that sometimes the greatest acts of love come with 4 paws and an unwavering heart as they sat together in the growing dusk. Surrounded by the life they had built from one desperate night, they understood that their story was both an ending and a beginning, a testament to the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals and the endless ways love finds to bring us home.